Welcome to this class on Neuroscience of Human Movement. In this class, we will discuss parietal and premotor cortex. This is part 2 of our discussion on parietal and premotor cortex. So, in today's class, we will be talking about how objects location in space is represented in cortical area, something that we discussed in the previous class, and the crucial role of the intraparietal area and the parietofrontal pathways involved in reaching and grasping, and how different sets of neurons respond to different types of stimuli. For example, tactile and visual stimuli in the intraparietal area, there are neurons dedicated for different types of stimuli, and motor plans for reaching. And of course, the idea that Newtonian physics alone cannot explain the cortical mechanisms that underlie motor planning. Right. Something that we discussed in the previous class is the notion of near space. The space that is closest to my body is called as near space, and the space that I can reach by extending my limbs is called as peripersonal space or reaching space, and the space that I can view, but not necessarily reach without making leg movements, of course, without actually taking a walk. For example, if I am not able to reach, then that space is called as far space or extrapersonal space. And as I mentioned that these areas or these maps are encoded in different regions. So, there are independent maps of these three regions in different regions of the brain. So, that is something that we discussed in the previous class. So, of particular interest for us in this discussion is the intraparietal area. Turns out that that is the intraparietal region, and specific regions within the intraparietal region contribute to specific function, something that we will very briefly discuss in this class. Right. For example, there is an area here, right, that is called as the VIP area. VIP means ventral intraparietal area, not very important person, but rather ventral intraparietal area are the neurons in the ventral intraparietal area, right. And these neurons have reciprocal projections or reciprocal connections with the area F4 or the ventral premotor area. Okay. And what does this area F4 itself do? Right. F4 or the ventral premotor region actually has visual receptive fields that are anchored to specific body parts. So, that means that this particular region has something to do with how or the state of the particular part of the body. So, it turns out that when the eyes are making a movement, but not the body parts, it turns out that these set of neurons are not active, but they are active when the specific region of the body is actually moving. So, that means these are more related to the motor function. So, they are in the visual receptive field, however, they are more active during actions of specific regions of the body. Okay. So, this is the VIP set of neurons, and what is also present is the reciprocal connections between the other regions such as PEC and dorsal premotor cortex, and how areas in F1 and F4 are having reciprocal connections. Some of these that we will discuss in future slides. Right. When it comes to grasping though, right, anterior intraparietal neurons and the so called PFG neurons, they are called as PFG neurons, this is the name of the neurons. They are believed to be responsible for hand movements. Hand movements means movements within the hand, not reaching movements. Reaching movements involve movements of the arm, whereas the AAP and PFG neurons are believed to contribute for hand movements, right. And as I mentioned, the area F4 is active when the particular part of the body moves, but not necessarily when the eyes move. So, vision is something that is going to affect this less than actual movement, right. And also it is believed that area F5 has a set of neurons that can coordinate the hand to mouth movements, right, eating movement. Evolutionarily a very important activity for survival, is it not? So, there are special neurons that are dedicated for this activity, the hand to mouth movements. Also it is very well known, of course, we have had several discussions in great detail about how the primary motor cortex, the area that is just rostral to the central sulcus, right, has a very large disproportionate representation of hand, or has a large number of neurons that control hand function, right. We also saw the importance of corticomotor neurons, or those motor neurons that provide monosynaptic projections to alpha motor neurons that control the finger function, is it not, something that we saw in previous classes. So, importantly M1 has a large representation of hand, and area F5 has specific neurons dedicated for hand to mouth movements, right. And anterior intraparietal neurons and the PFG neurons are believed to be responsible for hand movements, right. Also note that there are sets of neurons whose field of activity are can be tactile or can be visual. So, what is presented here is a neuron whose field is, whose tactile field is here. Note that tactile fields are presented in orange and visual fields are presented in purple, right. So, this is the tactile field of one neuron, this is the tactile field of a different neuron, is it not. The purple regions though indicate the visual fields for different sets of neurons. Note that there may be directional preferences within these neurons. Some of these neurons may have specific directional preferences, or in other words may be involved in movements in a particular direction, but not the opposite direction also. This is another thing. Note this is something that we saw in the previous class, where we discussed the work of Georgopoulos, where we discussed how activity of population of neurons in the primary motor cortex encode or predict the direction of movement, right. Here also this is true, there are neurons that have specific directional tuning associated with it, right. Also receptive fields of neurons in region F4 for example can be 3 dimensional, for example like that, for example like that, etc., right. So, these are receptive fields of different sets of neurons. Note the net behavior of the organism is a combination of activity of all these neurons, is it not. This is not a single neuron, the animal has millions of neurons. Here what we present is the receptive field of a smaller subset of those neurons, is it not. So, just presenting the various possibilities here, right. Also Richard Anderson and his colleagues have found that reach related areas of the parietal cortex is very important for specifying the target, but not in how the action is to be performed. That is the target, how you go there is beyond the scope of parietal area, right. So, encoding of the location of the target is a crucial function of this region, but exactly how that region will be reached or that particular target will be reached is something that is not encoded, that is not cared for by this region, which is the parietal region, right. And also note that this is in the coordinate system or in the frame of reference of the gaze, not necessarily in the absolute coordinate system or not necessarily in the body centered coordinate system. So, this is in reference to the eye reference frame, right. Eye as in not eye, a lot of people have the eye reference frame. This is not the reference frame I am talking about. I am talking about EYE reference frame, right. So, this encoding of target location happens in the frame of reference of the eye, right. And neuronal activity actually does not vary with the position of the limb, but it does vary with the direction of gaze. If the direction of gaze is in one particular direction, but the limb is in some position. So, depending on the direction of gaze, the activity will vary. So, that means that there are independent neurons that encode the target in the gaze direction frame of reference, right. Also importantly, cortical mechanisms cannot be explained by merely using Newtonian physics, right. Let us take this for a moment and understand what this means. Right. We are organisms who in some sense obey laws of physics, is it not? So, just because we are independent organisms, it is not like we can violate Newton's laws, right. For example, if you jump off the first floor, you will fall down and get injured, right. So, that means we do obey Newton's laws. That I mean trivially, even while walking we obey Newton's laws. So, we do obey Newton's laws, but the question is not that. The question is, does the cortical system inherently solve the Newtonian equations? Internally, does it solve the Newtonian equations? Now, that is a different question, right. It turns out that our behavior correlates well with the solutions of Newtonian mechanics, but that does not necessarily mean that our brain is explicitly computing solutions to Newton's equations. These are two different things, is it not? So, in other words, the actual actions that we make is based on some emergent properties of the dynamic interaction between the central nervous system and the body and the environment. So, a lot of dynamic interactions going on between these two systems, right, and what happens as the outcome is an emergent outcome, right. But this is not dependent on the formalisms and the first principles of physics or mechanics, right. So, we teach in the department of applied mechanics. This might be surprising for you to know that I am saying that human movements are not actually the outcome of mechanics. I am not saying they do not follow mechanics or rules of mechanics or the laws of mechanics, they do, but the actual movements that are made are dependent on factors other than the laws of physics, and it just turns out that the results, the outcomes correlates quite well, or in other words, we do not explicitly, or the central nervous system does not internally solve Newton's equations explicitly, right. So, in other words, it is not like F is equal to ma and then there is m and acceleration that is computed, right. That is not what happens, right. So, what happens is probably an emergent outcome, important. So, this is emergent dynamic mechanical properties of the system that is encoded, that is that determines the outcome. But since we do live in constant interaction with the physical world, and the physical world or the inanimate world follows Newton's laws, a lot of our actions or all of our actions also follow Newton's laws, but we do not solve F is equal to ma. F is equal to ma is true for us, but it is not that we are computing this, right. So, that is the point. So, we cannot merely take Newton's laws and say these are the equations that are solved by the cortical mechanisms or the cortical system to achieve movements, right. So, that is not what is happening. It is definitely tempting to use these as principles that the central nervous system may be following, right. So, essentially it is easy to say that this is what the central nervous system is doing, right, because the methods and approaches in physics and mechanics and engineering are relatively well developed. For example, in control theory, right, the specific approaches and methods are very well developed in comparison, for example, with neuroscience or biology, right. So, a problem that comes with borrowing terminology from other disciplines is that it is tempting to use the results in those disciplines or interpretations in those disciplines as what happens in the original discipline, or for example, the interpretations in physics are not necessarily true from the biological viewpoint, right. So, in summary, the object's location is represented in cortical areas in multiple independent regions, right, and the crucial role of the intraparietal area, and actually we mentioned two of these, the VIP and the AAP area, and the specific parietofrontal pathways that are involved in reaching and grasping, and we also said there are special neurons in area Fi that are dedicated to hand to mouth movements, and there are sets of neurons that are that independently encode tactile and visual stimuli in the intraparietal areas, and the direction of gaze, for example, or parietal region encodes plans in the direction of gaze based coordinate system, right, and cortical mechanisms cannot be explained by using Newtonian physics. So, with this we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you very much for your attention.